Okay, we're going to go live a little bit early here. We have a special fun thing that we're doing, so bear with me because we're going to have to send the links differently than normal. So let's see here and we'll get started soon. Let me grab this link. Okay, just bear with me. We're going to be doing this link, say send. Alrighty, then we'll come here. Okay, cool. He's got it. He already found it on there. So we didn't have to go early. In any event, it doesn't matter. So let's do the rest of getting ready here. Say leave. Yeah. Okay, good. All right. So in the meantime, before we start, as we shuffle together and get everything going, one moment here. Let's add the slides. So we are going to be continuing today for another hour and a half our Saturday deep dive into Jordan Peterson through the context of Nietzsche, because our Backbone Year 3 course is looking once again at philosophy through the lens of Nietzsche with his hammer. So it's our third chance to look at philosophy. We're doing the year 1 stuff with the cherry picking. We're doing the year 2, which we haven't started yet. It's really exciting. But now we're going to look at Jordan Peterson in the context of that Nietzsche material. Now, I've just sent the link to Mark, who can't be with us today, but we have a special treat because we will be entertaining him on a long drive with small children. So, and with some friends. So they're packing up the car right now. He's got the link and they will be listening in, although he won't be able to be here with us to contribute on a very, very long drive that they're going to be on today. So, without further ado, or without much further ado, we will pick up where we left off with Jordan Peterson. Again, we know all the other things we've been talking about, and this is the 10th class in our deep dive into Jordan. So let's get going.
That's not an easy thing. There are lots of us, and like life is bloody complicated. And the other thing that happens too is, again, if you scratch just beneath the surface of people, and this is something that's always, you know, to me has been a kind of miracle, is if you talk to someone, they're out doing their job, and maybe they're doing a good job at it, like some emergency room nurse, it's God, there's a job for you. Or maybe they work in palliative care, and you talk to them and you find out they've got like four, as I said before, serious problems in their family, and maybe they're diabetic to boot, and yet they haul themselves out of bed in the morning and go take care of dying people. It's like, good God, people deserve a bit of respect for struggling forward and not always trying to make the planet a worse place when they're beset on all sides constantly by an unending series of tragedy. You'd think we could have a little bit of sympathy for ourselves as a consequence of that. It's like we're not all like rapacious, greedy monsters who are bent on just devouring everything in our path. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So, all right. Anyway, so let's go to the next part of this here. All right. So, and God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Well, to understand that, because how did that doesn't make any sense at all, really. So I think I told you a little bit about this before. So the world that's being created in this particular account is a phenomenological world. There's a disk of land, because if you go out in a field and you look around, you're on a disk of land, so that's pretty obvious. And then there's a dome on top of it. It's more or less held up by the mountains, and rain comes down, so there's water above the dome, because where else would the rain come from? And underneath the ground, there's fresh water. You can drill down and find that. And then
All right, so we can make a quick comment here. We've been talking about Peterson's approach to mythopoetic texts and scriptures as narrative and as mythopoetic. So as trying to tell us something, but maybe not in a straightforward propositional way, and with the Jungian idea of being tapped into these deep archetypes. Um, now what he's saying is, okay, so how do we as post-Cartesian modern scientismists approach a text where the description of the cosmos is what we know it factually, objectively not to be, right? That's basically the question that's being answered here. And one of the best sources for this is a short book that was turned into a book, I think, by lectures that C.S. Lewis was giving, called The Discarded Image. If you like C.S. Lewis, you really should read this. It's a non-fictional work of his where he talks about the medieval perspective on the cosmos, the medieval cosmology. But he makes a very important point where he says, and what's really fun about his lectures is that while he's giving them off the top of his head, he'll be making claims about the way medieval people thought about the cosmos. And then to back up his claims, he'll be quoting lines of poetry that nobody's ever read in forever. And like they're just in his memory, like, oh, for instance, this line and that line that shows that this is how they thought the earth was round. And if you went through the middle, things would be upside down if you look back, and all of that type of thing. So what he did is he said, okay, wait a minute. They had an idea of the objective reality, like the physical objective reality, which we've been talking about in a scientism age, as saying sort of that's the ultimate kind of truth. Is that they understood that. They knew how to think that way. Just because they were also thinking mythopoetically doesn't mean that they weren't capable of thinking in that way. That doesn't mean that they developed, post Galilean and science from a Francis Bacon type of understanding or anything like that. But what it means is that it wasn't like an alien way of talking to them to ask questions in that context, where the appropriate answer would be something where you've extracted the subject from the world and you're just describing formulaically the likelihood of something happening. Instead, it's more like they were less interested in that. Like, we've elevated that to the highest level of truth, but they saw themselves as subjects in the world. And so they could talk about the objective reality of the planet, but they also had a cosmology which contradicted it. And they didn't feel any tension there, or they didn't feel like that was some sort of we have to give up one for the other. And so it's a really good book because he says, okay, the earth is flat and it's a disc, and there's a dome on top, and there's like 7 layers of domes on top of that. And there's different regimes of influence and all these things. And you say to yourself, okay, how could you believe that the earth is flat? Well, they didn't believe the earth was flat. They thought it was round. And so by pointing that out, he can say, okay, ask yourself the question, how could they believe both those things? And the answer is something like, if the question I'm asking is what is the objective reality of the planet, then it's answered this way. If the question I'm asking is what is it like to be in the universe, to be a part of it, who am I as a character on a planet, then the answer is this other one. Like, what's my relationship to nature and to the divine and to other individuals, right? So it was asking two different questions and answering them with two different approaches. The subjective, which means not relative, but it means simply taking into account the subjects as primarily of interest, and the objective as saying, well, let's extract the subject and let's just measure things. And so Peterson is not making that point. Instead, he's saying, let's have a little so there are other ways of trying to understand how the ancients, so we're talking, 10,000 years ago, maybe 250,000 years ago. How was it that our ancestors thought about their place on the planet? And what he's doing is he's saying, well, you know, he's not making use of that distinction. He's saying, well, maybe it's just not that unreasonable to think, if, again, starting as a character, and we're writing narrative here, which is the language for characters, how is it so unreasonable to set the stage artistically and poetically as, there's earth and underneath it there's water. So we'll let him finish with that depiction. But the case he's making is it's not that unreasonable to think of yourself as, on a disc. If you look at what directions you can travel, you're not a flying creature, so you don't think in that way. And if you're in the water, having that extra dimension can be quite terrifying to you, right? That's where the leviathans and the sharks come from. So the type of consciousness you as a subject have is one that can look in 360 degrees, right? You can look in 2 pi radians, and so you're kind of on a disc because you can kind of look the same distance in all those directions. And so if you're talking to the character whose perspective is like that, you can describe being that way, and there's no issue. All right. Um, Peterson tends to go with the approach of saying, well, science wasn't invented until the 1600s. So, of course, there were no scientists. So that means that what they're writing isn't to be interpreted scientifically. And so, again, he's still just barely getting into the first few verses of Genesis. We've done 10 classes now, and we're not even halfway through the second video here. But to reverse back to this point that we were making before and kind of highlight it, the idea is the Richard Dawkinites, not Richard Dawkins necessarily, but the Richard Dawkinites who say, I think the objective scientific truth is the ultimate way that something can be true, who then approach the Bible and say, I adjudicate that it doesn't understand how isotopes work and the age of the earth is wrong and all of that. So therefore it's false and it's wrong and we'll dismiss it. And the literalist fundamentalist types who say the highest form of truth is this objective scientific truth. So, therefore, everything the Bible says should be read that way. The scriptures should be read that way. And therefore, the science must be wrong because it must be that it's telling me about that type of truth, are both very similar to each other. And the William Jamesian, the existentialist and pragmatic approach, right? So, this is all in the context of Nietzsche and what we've talked about. This other approach says, now, wait a minute, hold on a second. That objective conversation is very interesting and super helpful, and no one's trying to throw it away. And if anybody claims anything that has empirical consequences, which outrages the outcome of your experiments, we'll just presume that they're likely wrong and we'll try to hash it out with more experiments. That's the right way to go forward. However, it's a very limited conversation. If I ask, how should I live? How to relate to nature and the divine and other people familially and socially, that's not the language that could add anything to it, right? What are you going to describe me as a mass of molecules and reduce it all to some physics or something? It's not the appropriate language. And yet there is a language, as Spinoza pointed out. We have two languages available to us. There is a language of the subjective, not again meaning relativistic, which in our age, we have it as a pejorative, but rather of the language of talking to subjects as if they're primary and that their consciousness is the first thing that we're addressing, and then how it is to them, truths to live by, as Peterson said last time. So, in any event, let's continue from there with all that in mind.
Around that. There's salt water, and so that's the world. And it's kind of an empirical world, because if you're a child and you just go out in the field and you look at the world, that's sort of what it would be like. And so that's the world that's being created. And so one of the things that is worth thinking about, and this is something Carl Jung was very interested in, is that these old descriptions are half geographical and half empirical, so sort of based on observation, and half psychological. So one of the things Jung was interested in, for example, was astrology, but mostly for a psychological reason, because there are stars up on the dome, and then when you look at the stars, you can imagine the shapes of the stars, and that helps you orient yourself, because as soon as you can see shapes in the stars, then you can recognize the constellations and you can orient yourself at night. But then the constellations become gods, say, and the gods turn into a drama. And the drama comes from within. It's the projection of imagination. And so when Jung was analyzing astrology, he was analyzing psychology, because he saw the astrological narrative as the projection of the human imagination onto the cosmos. And so when he was analyzing astrology, he was analyzing psychology. And the same thing is the case with these stories, is that the world they describe is it's not the natural world like a scientist would describe it, because these people weren't scientists. They didn't have the technology and the tools. It was the way for them, it was the world. For us, it's the way they saw the world. And so we're looking at the way they saw the world. And a lot of that psychology, and we share that psychology to a large degree with those people. So in this is psychology. But it's interesting to know what the geographical substrate is, so that you can kind of understand the stories. And I like this picture because it's great from a psychological perspective. It's a very famous picture. And so basically what you have here is the world as we know it, and there's the dome with the sun and the moon on it and the stars. And then if you look outside what you know, well, then you're out into this cosmic space, right? And those are like the wheels of the planets, and the music of the spheres. And that's the ever-present explorer who's gone beyond the domain that he can understand and is peering out into the unknown as such. And it's a psychological picture. It's like, because you do know some things, and then outside of that, there are things you don't know. And when you're feeling brave, you put a foot or two out where you don't understand, like, because there's frontier everywhere, right? And if you're if you're feeling heroic and you want to do something for the world and you want to expand what you understand, you
So sorry, really quickly, just in the context of what we've been talking about, if you remember from the second year material, which I know we don't have recorded yet, but which you and I were talking about in the after conversation last night, Savad. Um, he's made a distinction here. There's the way the world is, and there's the way it seems to be for our ancestors. And Peterson's approach is to say, well, the way it seemed to them was what they thought it was, but we can have the distinction between what it is and what it is like for them. And then that would allow us to get into the narrative and the story, perhaps. And maybe there's some other reasons for doing that. But this is again the two languages, right? Spinoza said there's these two languages available to us. Fichtel said there are two psychological camps into which every philosopher can be placed. Quickly, his definition: those who get their identity, it's a psychological camp. Those who get their identity from their ability to measure, predict, and manipulate a world external to themselves, and those who get their identity from their relationship with and their ability to engage with, measure, and wrestle with and be shaped by notions internal to themselves. And so you can imagine that lens applied to post-Cartesian rationalism and empiricism, but also post-Thalesian and Anaximandrianism and Anaximenianism. Like the Parmenideans are clearly doing one, and we'll see that in year two. We'll see the same cycle repeating. Socrates did this thing, and then Plato and Aristotle were pointing in different directions, and so it starts the digression between those two. Now, we say all that to remember that, okay, he's talking about these two different languages, he's making that distinction, and then we say, okay, what Hegel said was, if you could ever unite the two so that in one statement you're saying both the subjective and the objective reality, he said he called that the end of history. He said that would be the end of history. There would be nowhere to go beyond that, as if the cosmos is like a supercomputer designed to solve a problem and the problem's been solved or something like that. I mean, it wouldn't be fair to put those words into Hegel's mouth right now, but we can deal with the concept how we want to in that way if we feel. What we've been talking about in the Consummate Thinkers course, and what we'll be showing, is that this poetry not only repeats, but that there are these moments where something I'm calling a consummate thinker comes in. And that really what's happening is that there is a unification of the two, but it's like orgasm. It's not a place you can remain. It's a thing where you require the two different principles, the masculine and feminine depictions, or the two different approaches, and the friction and the debate between them, which just gets, sort of more intense and more intense right before you get the next consummate thinker who unifies them, like Thales and Socrates and Descartes, that somehow is doing both a rationalism and affirming that we only know things through experience, which all of them explicitly did, right? So we've seen that enough now that we don't have to talk about it again, and we'll do it when we do the second year material. um So in this context, it's possible, I'm not arguing this is the case, and we can certainly argue about it, but it's possible that philosophy, by restricting itself to propositional, argumentative, reason-based discussion, like the truth we get is a proposition that could be true or false, and we'll argue it out by looking at the consequences, that what it's doing is not quite as deep as what the mythopoetics were doing, that they could get into a realm where a direct encounter with the truth, where, okay, so in the mythopoetry, what do we have? We have Christ saying, I am the truth. That sounds really strange to people who think of the truth as a proposition, right? I will be true, my darling. The arrow flies straight and true. Like, what kind of notions of truth are these things? Well, the Thalesian, the Socratic, right? Socrates said, I want to relate to this thing, right? They're all talking in exactly that way. So there are a few philosophers, these consummate thinkers, who are doing philosophy, but they're also writing in narrative, and they're writing in meditations, which are processes that you're supposed to go through. They're mystical texts, right? They're relying on the use of narrative and drama and literary techniques in order to try to express a truth that might be too deep for it to be a proposition you could sign your name to, or some notion that you could wrap your mind fully around. So in any event, we talked about that yesterday. It'd be worth highlighting really quickly, but I'm going to shut up and let's let Dr. Peterson
poke
continue.
your head through what you know and you take a look at the at whatever structure is out there. And he's pretty smart because most of them is still where it's safe. And I would say that's a good thing, because if you jump right out there, well, then maybe you fall off the edge of the earth, and I wouldn't precisely recommend that, especially if you do it accidentally. And to me, this is a recreation of the Taoist yin yang symbol, with the white paisley here, and that's what you know, and the dark paisley serpents really there. And the right place to be is right on the line between them, because you're sort of, you got one foot where you understand, that gives you security, and then but it's kind of dull, because hey, you know everything that's going on there, and that isn't what people are like. They don't want just security. Dostoevsky said that in Notes from the Underground, a great book. And he said, I love this. It was an early criticism of the notion of a political utopia. He said, look, if you gave people everything they wanted, they had nothing to eat but cake, and nothing to do but sit in warm pools and busy themselves with the continuation of the species. That was his lines. That the first thing they would do, well, maybe after the first week, was like go kind of half insane and smash everything up, just so that something that they didn't expect would happen, so that they'd have something interesting to do. And it's so right, because the utopian notion that if you just had all the material stuff you wanted, that you'd be, well, what would you be? What would you do? Would you just sit on the couch and watch TV? I mean, you'd be, I don't know what, you'd be cutting yourself just for entertainment in no time flat, and that's the sort of thing that people do. And so we're not adapted for security and utopia. We're adapted for a certain amount of security, because, we are vulnerable, but mostly we want to have one foot out where we don't know what the hell is going on, because that's where you're alert and alive and tense and with it. And I believe this, and I believe it actually has something to do with the hemispheric structure of the physiology of your brain, is because the right hemisphere looks roughly adapted to what you don't know, and the left hemisphere, this is an oversimplification, but a useful one, is adapted to the world that you do know. And the right place for you to be is halfway between them, because and you can tell that. That's what's so cool. And this tells you that this is actually reality that's manifesting itself to you. That sense of active engagement you have in the world when things are working well for you, where you should be at the right time. You're alert and on top of things and engaged, and you don't have much of a sense of time. And the sense of the tragedy of life sort of recedes. And that's when you've got one foot where it's secure, and one foot out in the unknown.
Okay, I wasn't going to do this earlier, but this is so fitting. Okay, so remember Peterson has this notion of paradiso, paradise, as the walled garden, and he also has this idea of the cosmos, the arche, the source of all being, that thing that these consummate philosophers were about. He has this picture of it with the terminology he typically uses and uses often of order and chaos and the dance between them, right? So this notion is that paradiso means walled garden, which means if you've got too much wall, you're in a Nazi hellhole where everything's defined by you, or by your genetics. It's all determined. We know where you should be and what should happen, and you should be burned and you should be exalted and whatever. But it's all defined because there's no room for any new idea. There's no room for any outside the box. There's just, it's all way too defined. It's 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 Uranus eating Zeus. It's the bad side of the paternal of these two principles. Now, we're not saying one's masculine, one's feminine. We're saying that um in the mythopoetic language, one is depicted as masculine and one is depicted as feminine. So it's the tyrannical father who says, you're not what I wanted you to be, and you're not going to conform, so I'm going to devour you and destroy you. That's the hell on one side. The hell on the other side is okay, wait a minute. Okay, right. So the hell on the other side is the communist hell. It's the hell of, hey, there are no walls. We have no boundaries. It would be good if we were all free and creative and everything was great. It's like, yeah, that's great, except nobody cares enough to protect you a little bit. There's no walls, right? A walled garden can't have so much wall that nothing can grow, but it can't have no walls so that the elephants trample what's trying to grow there, right? So it's always about trying to find a balance between two potential hells. And so again, there's a tri-unity at the base of being, which again we've seen emerge, and we will when we redo the second year backbone course on the consummate thinkers. That something has emerged with all of them, right? Descartes says, I exist in the mean between absolute being and nothingness. And Socrates has his line metaphor, right? There's this yin yang symbol picture that the consummate thinkers keep getting close to, and Peterson's saying, okay, I'll name them. They're probably too deep for a name, but a name that seems to work is that which I think I understand and that which I know I don't understand. Order and chaos, and that everything should be a reflection of that because it's the arche. So everything should be a reflection of it, including the two hemispheres of your brain. And he talks about how one makes models and then is cognitively blind to things that don't fit with its model, while the other one is imagining fantasies of monsters coming after you. And you put your hand in a dark room and it's just working to come up with possible theories, right? And so, what psychological health might be is something like good communication between the two, where I have a working model, but the things that the part of my brain that's always looking for exceptions can actually communicate, hey, your model needs an update. And so we exist as the ones going back and forth between, hey, here's the chaos I don't understand, holy cow, that's big, that's everything, that's, monsters live there, that's where the dragons live, right? That's the negative side of the feminine. The positive is the mother earth side, you know fruit growing from trees, nursing at a breast. You don't know that you need anything. It's the realm where you don't know anything, but yet things are coming to you. But it's also the thing that will kill you because the wolves and the dragons live there, and you don't know anything about them, and you don't know what plants do for good or ill and things like that. But then the hero is the one who lives between them. He's the one who goes into that and throws a net around it, cuts it up, develops science and medicine, says, okay, I'm going to take the unknown and I'm going to turn it into something I have a model for that makes sense. But then the problem is you're immediately in a new hell because now you're blind to all of the things you didn't take into account because it's the entire cosmos. You can't have a map of everything unless it's a one-to-one map. So it's necessarily insufficient. And what you need to do is, as soon as you've got a model that's working, immediately start looking for ways to tear it down. Look for something that it's not taking into account because what you don't know is more important than what you think you do know. And then as soon as you've torn it down, you don't just sit there and say, okay, good, now I don't know anything. You immediately try to make sense of it again. So we're always living in this back and forth. And he's talking about, the existentialists really hit on this, which is this idea that humans aren't happy, content. They're not built to be sitting in a garden, right? How long did it take? God made a garden for us and he put a tree right in the middle of it. And how long did it take for us to be like, okay, let's do something. Let's do something interesting. Let's arrogantly usurp this whole thing because something better or something else, something of significance needs to happen. And again, I don't want to be heretical. There's some Christian theologians who might be able to explain why that was wrong, but it is a fact that that is the way that we are. Right? That's at least also a part of the story, and that's all we have to affirm. Um, so in any event, he's discussing that.
And your brain signals to you that you're in the right place by making what you're doing meaningful. And that sense of meaning is actually a neurophysiological signal that you've got the forces of the cosmos properly balanced in your being at that moment. And that's why it feels so good. And then, well, what else could it possibly be? I mean, our brain is capable of looking beyond our vision. That's what it's for. And that sense of engagement, there's no reason to assume that that's anything but a real signal. And you can reduce it. You could say, well, the problem with being where you know only is that you don't know everything. And that's going to be a problem in the future. And the problem with being where you know nothing is that's just too much, man. Like, you go into panic mode and because anything can happen there and you can't handle it. So you got to mediate between those two things. You want to be secure enough so that your physiology isn't revving out of control, and you want to be out there in the unknown enough so that you keep updating yourself constantly, constantly, constantly. And that's the place where information flow is maximized. And you know that because that's where you are when you're having a really interesting conversation with someone, or you're gripped by a book, or you're really into a movie, or maybe something that you do as a apart from your work, or maybe even in your work, you're into it. And that's because you are in the right place at the right time. And your whole nervous system is signaling that to you. And I would say that's the sort of place that you should be all the time. Of course, you can't be because no one's perfect, but that's the recreation of paradise on earth. It's something like it because you are in the right place at the right time when that is happening, subject to certain, what would you say, restrictions that we can talk about later. Well, that's what this guy's doing. And that's, I would say, akin to the action that God is taking when he's transforming the chaos of potential into habitable being. And it's the sort of thing that human beings are supposed to act out. And God said, let the waters under heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Well, that's an interesting thing too, because there's this play written by a German named Goethe. I can never say that properly. It's Johann van Goethe, and I
It's
can't say it,
Goethe.
but he wrote this play called Faust, and he wrote one part of it when he was quite young, and then Faust 2 when he was quite old. And he has a character in there, Mephistopheles, and Mephistopheles is the devil. And he actually has the devil explain himself twice, basically using the same words, which I really like. It was very profound. And basically, Goethe's Mephistopheles says, he's the adversary of the word. That's a good way of putting it. Because that's how it works out mythologically. He's the figure behind the snake in the Garden of Eden, which is something we'll talk about more. But he has a sophisticated philosophy. He's not just some random troublemaker. He's got a deep philosophy, and his philosophy is quite straightforward. And it's compelling. It's compelling. And people are gripped by it quite often, far more often than they think. His philosophy is,
Sorry, but we have to stop because he's going to give the devil's philosophy as depicted in Faust, and we're going to start right where he starts that. We remember that in the passage where in the third part of the Zarathustra, Nietzsche is climbing the mountain with this midget devil on his back. The devil. And the devil's whispering in his ear, everything comes to nothing in the end. All thrown stones must fall, right? This trajectory of being that you have as partly limited and partly with a divine spark, whatever this is, it's a trajectory. And so your path has been wonderful, but you're going to hit the ground eventually. All thrown stones must fall, which is another way of saying it comes to nothing in the end. It all comes to nothing in the end. It's the spirit that of gravity is what it's called, but it's the spirit that says it all comes to nothing in the end. It's the spirit aimed at nothingness. Now, this is very important. Nietzsche's mission was to triumph over nihilism. That's his greatest enemy, right? Is the thing that's aimed at nothingness. He wanted to have a yes saying philosophy to all things. He wanted to be able, as a man in the middle here between these two, he wanted to be able to have the position of God looking at all things and saying pronouncing it is exceedingly good. That's what he wanted his philosophy to accomplish, or him to accomplish. It has to be narrative. It has to be the character of Zarathustra, I think. I don't think it's accidental that there's this allegorical version of his most developed philosophy. But in any event, the character Zarathustra is supposed to accomplish that in the third part of this book. And he's dealing with this spirit of gravity that say it all comes to nothing in the end. And he's not bothered by it. He's not bothered by it at all. He sits it down and he tells it something philosophical that he knows that negates what he believes is the truth, that it doesn't all come to nothing in the end, that the heat death of the universe is an error or a myth, and that you don't get to be triumphant in the end. Like that's not the nature of being. We won't go into how he does that right now, but we'll mention that because to triumph over nihilism, the question is, okay, how does your philosophy triumph over nihilism? The answer is there is no argument that can be given to a nihilist to make them say nihilism is wrong. And there is no argument that a nihilist can give to a life affirmer to say that they are wrong and they should affirm nihilism. It's not based in proposition. The hatred that people have for all being, which is also a self-hatred, and it comes out. It's why they're so nasty all the time. Their self-hatred, because they're a part of all being, that hatred that they have for being, to wish that it was all nothing because, they have regrets and there's shame and these things that they're not dealing with or whatever, there is characterological, right? The character is the one who manifests being able to say yes to being, or says, I hate it all and I wish it all came to nothing. Nietzsche prophesied that nihilism was on the rise and it was going to wash over like a tsunami wave all of our culture and everything. And his mission was to try to swim to the other side of that abyss and find the solution. He claims to have done it. We'll leave that judgment for later. But in our backbone course, where we go line by line through Zarathustra, that's one of the things we'll be asking ourselves. But what's important is that the question itself is characterological and the answer is characterological. The devil is the character which says I will be triumphant and victorious, and I will be pleased when everything comes to nothing. That will be my great victory because it's aimed at nothingness. That's nihilism. The divine voice says, "This is exceedingly good. It's so good, I will make myself limited to be broken into pieces so that I can infuse the logos into the potentiality," right? We won't go into that again, but that's sort of this idea of the mythopoetic description of there's three things at the beginning. There's God, the spirit hovering over this water, right? This potentiality that's aimed at being but isn't able to be, and then this infinite being that's aimed and interested and curious about nothingness. So they're both the yin yang chasing one another, right? That image is emerging not only in the consummate thinkers, but also in this narrative, in this mythopoetic narrative. What's being depicted artistically for us is a love story. That being is a love story, and we won't talk about Nietzsche's idea right now, but his idea is that that doesn't end, and that nihilism and nothingness never has a triumph more than maybe a moment, or the smallest of all moments, or maybe never. But this is why, so this is very interesting because hell could be thought of as being when you don't want to be. And if it's impossible for being not to be, and you want nothingness, you're in hell. You don't have to wait till after you die. You're already in hell. You're a hell creature. You're bringing hell about. You're aimed at hell because you don't want to be, right? The devil goes to heaven and he's debating the case of Job with God. He's in hell when he's in heaven, right? He's if he is, if we think of the devil as aimed at nothingness in these contexts, we can also think of him as aimed at heaven, but without God on the throne. And there's other, right? We're not going to explore all of that right now. But if the concept of the devil is he who wishes that there is nothing, who doesn't have salvation, who doesn't have the divine spark, who doesn't have the ability to infuse into being the divine voice which says, "Yes, this is exceedingly good. I will sustain and even push creation towards something better. I'll be a part of that." If it's not that voice, if it's the voice that says it would be better if nothing had ever been, then being is hell. You can't, if it's true that you can't not be, or for the whole scope of time that you are, right? So the what's the insight here is that psychologic, or I'm sorry, characterologically, the aim of what direction you're aiming at. Do you, if you are a manifestation of the, let's call it the paternal will to inseminate. Let's call it the paternal will to see other things move forward into a better place. If that's your attitude towards being, which is positive and which says, look, there's a lot of suffering, but this is good. I affirm that we should make it even better. It's not good enough, but it's good. It's exceedingly good. If that's your attitude, there's no argument to tell you that you're wrong. And if your attitude is, I wish it was all nothing. I hate my own shame and sin and whatever it is. I wish it was all zero because then, whatever. If you're aimed at nothingness, there's no argument to tell you that you're wrong. The triumph over nihilism has to be characterological. So when Nietzsche presents that philosophy in the character of Zarathustra, it's not accidental that he's using narrative and mythopoetry. He's attempting to write another type of scripture. Now, we're not judging that it's correct or incorrect or blasphemous or heretical. We're not making any of those judgments. We're just saying his attempt is this. And because that's his attempt, I think it's not too much of a stretch to say he understood that that was necessary. I mean, it's the character of Zarathustra, which is the answer to the nihilism problem, because it's a characterological issue. It's not a propositional thing that you should be argued out of or into. It's where you're aiming. Okay, so that, with the context of looking at Jordan Peterson through Nietzsche, all of that was useful. But now we're going to shut up and get back to exactly what he's going to do, which is he's going to give us the Faustian demonic attitude, the Faustian satanic attitude towards being.
Well, look around at the world. It's like Ivan Karamazov in the Brothers Karamazov, when he's trying to disabuse his younger brother of being a Christian monk. Mephistopheles says, well, look at the world. I mean, you look around the world, it's nothing but a bloodbath. It's just suffering everywhere. Everything eats everything, and people die terribly, and they're cruel to one another, and the whole mess is nothing but a constant haul of terrible carnage and ruin and wreck. He says it would be better if it was never existed at all. And that's a very interesting, that's a very, very interesting idea. And I do believe, and I've seen this in people many times, that in the depths of despair, especially when you've been betrayed, for example, and you wander into the wrong subdivision of the underworld, that's something that comes to mind. If you have a very sick child, for example, or maybe your whole family is suffering, as whole families do sometimes, an idea is going to come to you. It's like, good God, who put this mess together? And is it really worth it? Is it really worth the suffering? Suicidal people, they say no. They say, no, enough of this. And you have to be pushed a long way, generally speaking, before you'll actually commit suicide. You have to be in very, very desperate straits. But your answer under those conditions is that being is such that it would be better if it had never been. And that's a very, I think it's a terrible philosophy, I believe, because I think what happens if you act it out is that you make the very things that led you to despair far worse. And I can't see that if it's reasonable to draw a logical conclusion that suffering should justifies your desire to make being end, that the answer to that can't be to produce more suffering.
Okay, so that's quite interesting. So I was saying the problem is characterological, and I was tracing it back to this Nietzschean notion. Peterson has just said something contrary to that. He thinks he has an argument for why it's irrational philosophically and illogical to be aimed in this nihilistic, it's still characterological, but this nihilistic characterological attitude. And his argument is an interesting one. It's worth highlighting and focusing on. What he's saying is, okay, you're upset, you're bitter, you're unhappy with being. Why? Look at the injustice. I mean, we've read Dostoevsky in some of our other classes. It's pretty goddamn powerful case he's making there, right? It's pretty rough. Although Alyosha's there too, and he has a response, which we'll get to in a moment. But he said, okay, this is pretty bad. Um, children are tortured and then they die. That happens. That is what happens on this planet. It's happened even once. If that was necessary for being, that it be designed in a way where that can even happen once, fuck being. To hell with being, to tear it all down. This isn't right. And remember, um, you know, Alyosha's brother says to him, he says, look, if God redeems everything and every tear is dried and every eye is dried and we all are reconciled to one another and there's this perfect heaven that says, look, it was necessary for all that to happen, but look, there's a redemption plan. He says, I would look at that God and I would say, no, thank you. If this was necessary that it even happen, even if the child himself hugs his abuser and everyone's right and they all realize how and everybody goes to heaven, no matter how good the outcome is, I'm going to decline that offer. No, thank you, God. This wasn't worth it. Okay. Um, I know that we're studying the Torah here. It's also, though, we have to accept the basis of the Christian scriptures. And I want to highlight something that's quite interesting here, which is that the Christian idea of the logos, which Peterson talked about in the last lecture, was that this is the third ingredient of the communication between these two infinite primordial ingredients that make up everything, right? The order and the chaos, the infinite being and the potentiality. Okay. The communication between them is the logos, right? John 1 1, he put it up there. In the beginning was the word and the word was with God and the word was God, right? There's this Christian notion of interpreting the idea that God is speaking into the chaos, into the ocean, into the waters, something that allows things to be, that there's a communication between the two, and that required the unlimited to be broken, to become limited and broken, right? Because the Christians also have the verse that says, from the foundations of the earth Christ was crucified. Okay, here's an interesting idea that occurred to me while listening to Peterson right now about this Christian notion. And I think that if we could wave a magic wand and Christians, uh, people who profess to be Christians, would start and say, whatever Christ means, it's at least this much, we would be in an even better place than we are right now. I'm not picking on Christians. I'm not saying they're a net negative, but it would be pretty positive. And the notion is this: if Christ is the embodiment of the divine's willingness to die in order to let things be, in order to become limited, in order to allow this world that he calls very good to exist, if that's what he is, then the Christian message to be Christ-like, Christians who say, I care about Christ, I talk about him all the time, I'm very God bothered, Christ, 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 he did it. No, wait, Christ said, take up your cross and follow me. That's actually a commandment. And maybe in Christian theology, the work Christ did is what allowed through grace your ability to have a life affirming attitude. All right. We're not saying this is correct and we're not saying it's incorrect. We're not criticizing or preaching Christian theology right now. We're saying, hold on a moment. The gospel message, let's preach the gospel message for a second. The gospel message might be if you're aimed at nothingness and hell, and you're already living in hell, you don't have to wait to die to find out that's where you go. You're not going there, you're there. You hate being, and you are. Okay. You better hope you stop being at some point because if you keep being, you're definitely still in hell. Okay, if what you want is salvation from that, right? We'll use their terminology. It's very simple. If you want salvation from that, the answer is be like the thing which will sacrifice to make things better. That's what God is like. Be more godlike, more godly, and also be more Christ-like. That's 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 a heck of a message. And it's what do we mean be more Christ-like? We don't we mean is be willing to sacrifice to make things even better, right? That's how you are in your actions, in embodied, right? We've been looking at the not just the pragmatists, but we've been looking at the phenomenologists and the pragmatists. I mean, that is the manifestation of saying yes to being. The manifestation, if you don't want to say, "Oh, if I could only say yes to being, then I'd be fine." Say what you want. Say yes, say no. The proof that you're saying yes to being is that you're willing to put into it what you have to put into it, to let go of your life and therefore find it, right? That's another Christian verse, right? If you hold on to it, you're going to lose it anyway. But if you let it go, if you aim at the cross, if you look at saying, "Well, how can I be torn to pieces to make this a better thing?" You're going to find eternal significance, profound meaning, and you'll be able to say yes to being and you'll help be a part of that divine project of making things better. Okay, I'm sorry. Enough with diving into Christian theology, but I I would be interested in some Christian theologians to come in and tell me, have I just depicted the gospel in a heretical or inaccurate way? So maybe we'll get someone here to do that at some point. But I think that something like what I was saying is a part of what Peterson's pointing at and trying to get across. So let's watch.
That just doesn't make sense. And my observation has been that people who act out the Mephistophelian philosophy inevitably make suffering far worse. And then that raises the other specter of, well, do they want being just to cease, or are they just out for bloody revenge at any cost? And my conclusion has always been that is that the mask is, well, being shouldn't exist because it's too terrible, but the true motivation is I'm going to make everyone suffer as much as I possibly can before I say goodbye to this place. And if you read the writings of people like the kids who shot up the Columbine High School, they'll tell you exactly that that's precisely and exactly what they concluded and then acted out. So anyways, but in this, God says that it was good. And I've thought about that a lot. It's like, because the question is something like, well, is something better than nothing? Because that's a really good question, you know. And I thought about two things in relationship to that. And one is, well, maybe it depends on how it is that you are, right? Because it could be that there are ways of being in the world that justify the world, and there are ways of being in the world that make the world unbearable. And I believe that the narrative that runs through the biblical stories is precisely a dialogue between those two types of being. And the optimistic part of the story is that being requires limitation and suffering. There's no escape from that. But there are modes of being that allow that to be perhaps even more than tolerable. Perhaps there are modes of being that allow that to be good. And it's a straight and narrow road. It's a very difficult road to tread. So I think, well, that's possible. I'm not an optimist by nature, but that's one of the things that I've conceptualized and read about that I actually find plausible, because it's certainly the case. Everyone knows this, that there are ways that you can act that make things worse. Everyone knows that. And so if that's the case, there has to be the opposite, right? There has to be ways that you could act that make things better. And obviously you can act in ways that make things really way worse. And so the question is, well, are there ways that you can act that make things really much better? And I think that's the question, is can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we have the being that requires limitation and suffering, and also simultaneously transcend that by our mode of being? And I believe that the biblical stories, and perhaps not only the biblical stories, but the biblical stories are one of the human imagination's best attempts to address and answer that question. That's what the entire story is about. So the first of it is the catastrophe of the collapse of self-consciousness and the entrance of humanity into history. And the rest of it is, okay, now we're in history. Now we know that we're going to die. We know about our mortality. We're conscious of our own being. Is there a mode of acting in the world that allows that to be justifiable, or maybe even more, that allows that to be triumphant? And then I would also say, maybe it's worth finding out, that's the other thing that's so interesting, because you've got this short time on earth, and there's lots of things that are very, very difficult to contend with, and you have the problem of tolerating yourself even in all your insufficiency. And one of the things that seems to me to be the case is that if you adopt a sufficiently profound mode of being, if you attempt to do that, then the mere act of lifting up that weight is enough to justify the fact that you're insufficient and mortal and bound by tragedy. And I believe that, and I believe people believe that, because if you watch how people act, they look for people they admire. And they do admire people, right? It's a natural phenomenon. You see it starting with children. Children admire and then they imitate. And we look to people who seem to be able to bear the burden of being in a heroic manner, and there's something inside of us that calls to that, and that makes us want to mimic that and to follow it. And I think that that's the deepest and most profound of instincts, and I think it's right. And even if you're not so convinced on the positive end, because it's more difficult to be convinced of the positive, you can certainly be convinced on the negative end, because there are ways of being that are so brutal and so reprehensible that merely to read about them is enough to traumatize you. And I think that if you're a person who hasn't lost their soul completely, you can't help but encounter stories like that and shudder away from them. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was the person who did most to unmask the absolute horrors of communist totalitarianism, said that he believed that the Nuremberg judgments were the most important event of the 20th century. And that was the judgment at the end of World War II, that there were certain actions that no one was to undertake, no matter what their cultural background was, because they were, let's say, crimes against humanity. That there was such a thing as universal evil. And you can debate that, I mean, and people certainly have, but the problem is if you debate that, then you have to say that there are conditions under which the sorts of things that happen, say, in the concentration camps, which would be the gassing of children after their torture and their forcible removal from their parents and all the terrible things that went along with that, that's just okay. It's just an opinion. It's just something that happened, and there are circumstances under which that's justifiable. If there's no transcendent good and evil underneath that argument, it's only a matter of practicality. And it seems to me that that's not the right conclusion to draw. That's how it seems to me, and that's what Solzhenitsyn concluded when he looked at the Nuremberg trials. So the notion that it was good, well, even if you don't believe that, and because maybe it's not as good as it could be, I would say it's incumbent on you as someone who participates in the process of furthering creation to act as if it could be good, at least, and to further that with all of your efforts. Partly because what the hell else do you have to do that could possibly be better than that could possibly justify your existence more than that? And you know perfectly well, if you have any sense at all, if you think clearly about it at all, is that that's what you want to see in everyone else. It's you're desperate, and maybe you're cynical, and now and then someone appears that acts at least momentarily like a light in the darkness, and that lifts your spirit up and gives you a little bit of hope and maybe helps you continue on. It's, well, that's obviously a call to being. It's a statement from your own soul that says, well, there's something about that that's how you should be. And maybe then, well, we get a chance to participate in what is good. I've thought too,
Right. Typically, we stop so we can have half an hour of unrecorded after conversation about all this. But I don't want to stop since what he's doing right now is circling around attempts to make philosophical appeals to reasons for why you should be aiming. So maybe what we'll do is we'll let him give us another one of these. This is quite encouraging, and it's good work he's doing. So let's listen to his next case that he's going to make on this, and then we'll pause after that.
well, we'll leave that for a little later. And
Okay,
God said, let the earth.
okay, never mind. Okay, he's given us a lot. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to end the live stream. We're going to have our half hour of conversation about all of this and looking at some of these arguments. And we can do that a little bit right now before we end the live stream if you want. I know that Mark isn't here with us today, but he's listening in the car with some friends and relatives. So we get to be his podcast entertainment on his way right now. So hi, Mark, and all you fantastic people driving in fellowship on those fun country roads. Um, so what we can do is so let's rehearse a little bit about these attempted arguments he's making about which direction to aim, because even if, as I said before, there isn't a logical argument that moves you from aiming at hell to aiming at heaven or vice versa. It's important to notice both directions. There's no argument for it. However, you are the sorts of creatures who could respond to appeals like these. I see your note there. Okay. So he gave up on adding that extra argument there, and he's going to go into more scripture now, which is fantastic. I wish we could just sit here and watch all 10 videos, but we will pause it here. Um, so he you are the sorts of creatures who could vibrate to the kinds of appeals that he's pointing out. And so let's look at some of these logical arguments, because I think he kind of is aware of the fact that it's not exactly like a QED, but hey, there's something here to be considering. So the first one is, look, if you're annoyed at being and you're bitter about it and you're aimed at destroying yourself or others, if the Cain in you is trying to kill the Abel in you because it's frustrated, if you're bitterly like a shadow trying to grab at anything with substance, ineffectively trying to grab at anything with substance to tear down anybody who's doing anything good because you think it makes you look bad by comparison and you feel empty, like you have nothing. It's like, okay, well, hold on a second. Where are you? Just notice where you are and what you're aiming at. You're pissed off. Okay, you've got reasons. No one's disagreeing with that. We all have reasons. There's a lot of suffering involved in all of this. We're limited creatures. It's necessary. It's sewn into us. That's a part of it. Okay. Is the way you're behaving and what you're aiming at going to lessen your suffering or anybody else's, or is it going to make it a billion times worse? Maybe infinitely worse. Are you pushing everybody you can down into an even deeper pit for that mere momentary illusion that if they're being pushed down, therefore you've attained some elevation? It's not actually happening. There's a hopelessness here, and that's probably a part of your suffering, but you might be able to reasonably say, okay, is it possible to aim in another direction? Is there a light somewhere? Could I turn around and maybe that light is merciful? Maybe its arm is longer than I think it is. Maybe I could be clawing my way in another direction and see what happens there. And then he hints at the idea that, well, if you can make things infinitely horrible and you have no idea how bad they can be, right? He talks about Solzhenitsyn a lot. And one of the things he likes to illustrate, because he's talking about the picture of hell, is this fact that they had this communist revolution. They had this, hooray, we got rid of all the evil bad people that owned a donkey and a few acres, and we didn't have anything. We got rid of them. 2 years later, the government came through those same places where they had encouraged the same paramilitary groups to overthrow the whole system and put up signs on the walls reminding people that it wasn't moral to eat their own babies, that they were starving to death. It's like, okay, so things can get so bad that you can't imagine how bad they can get. And they can get so bad so much quicker than you think that perhaps you should pause and say, okay, am I helping to push things in that direction by making thoughtless accusations about reading the evil in other people's minds, for instance, which you see all over the internet? Am I pushing the world towards a hell that in very short order I'm going to realize I'm in and that it's going to come for me too? And where am I going to appeal that we shouldn't be there since I've been actively helping push us there? Maybe I should pause and say, okay, I should be a little more careful with what I say. Maybe I should shut up for a while and just not say anything until I navigate where the heck I really am and where I should be aiming. But then again, it's like he's attempting to make a case here, but he's not presenting it like it's a QED. He says, okay, if it's possible that things can be hell, maybe that's a suggestion that they could be so unimaginably good you can't imagine it either, right? Well, that's redundant, obviously, but maybe things could be really, really crazy good, and you haven't considered that. And maybe you should think, okay, what could I do to inch ourselves closer to that, or maybe start pushing in the other direction? Who knows what's possible? If we know it can get really bad, why are we rushing to prove that to ourselves? We already know. And then he also says it's unreasonable to make things worse because you're motivated by how bad they are, right? So again, it's not exactly like a wave your finger or you're doing the wrong thing and this is the logical argument for why you should do something else. It's not like that because we're too deep to be talked to that way. This is characterological. Our sufferings are personal and they're profound, and it's true for all of us. And but if you're going to sit there and go, well, you didn't suffer the way I suffered, and I'm going to make you suffer, and you're only making things worse. You're adding to the very thing that you think is justifying you in behaving in that way. And Peterson is suggesting that that's not reasonable, right? So he's giving again, he doesn't come off as saying I've figured it out and this is the formula, so think this way. It doesn't work that way. It's too You're too profound and deep for that. Your suffering's too profound and deep for that. The potentially tragic nature of, although with the scriptures it's a comedy that there is a happy ending, but you know the fact that there are many tragedies in being and many calamities and catastrophes and all of that stuff means that's not there's no formula for this. Instead, there's a way of being, right? There's a again with the Christians, there's a way of being the truth. There's a way of and then when he uses the terminology he uses of saying a mode of being, he's saying maybe you could be the kind of person who is married to the truth or pursuing the truth or unwilling to lie just because people are going to bring consequences to you otherwise. And instead of saying, hi, I'm so good at lying, I'll be at the top of this little shit pile of people pointing that everyone else is evil but me. That's not going to last. It's not going to last at all. They're going to eat you first as soon as they get anywhere in this system that you're moving us towards. It doesn't end well for you. What you should do is maybe say, holy shit, how pause. Let me be quiet. Let me be calm. Let me think about, is there a way? Maybe it's hopeless for me. Maybe it's too bad for me. Maybe there is no hope. But these stories that are telling me this is the way that I am and this is the way that being is, they do have a golden thread of hope running through them. It's a pretty ugly picture of reality that they give, but there's still hope at the same time. So maybe I should try to figure out what that is and perhaps by facing the things that seem too dark for me to face, including within myself, right back to the Jungian idea, which was really a Nietzschean idea as well. So we'll do a deep dive on Jung in the same context as Children of Nietzsche. But this idea that like your highest heights can't, your branches can't reach to the highest heights unless your roots go down to the lowest lows. And maybe it's necessary to face the deep abyssal realities and even the darkness that could be within yourself in order to integrate or to triumph over or to get what you need from traveling through hell to get to heaven, right? That's Dante again. And it's Virgil and it's Homer, right? It's the hero goes through hell to get to heaven. That's the only path that you can use to get there. So we're at least that's what the stories are telling us, and that's what we're looking at. All right, so we're going to stop there. We're going to go into the after conversation. We're going to wrap it up as usual in about 23 minutes, and then go get on with our weekend and have a good time. So we'll pick this up here again. We're doing a deep dive into Jordan Peterson. We'll look at his books. We'll do these other things. We've got 5 or 6 other people we're going to do deep dives in year 3, And deep dive is more than just reading a couple works. It's like a real deep dive. How is this person thinking, and what arguments do they think appeal, and what do they think is appropriate, and what do they think the answer might be, or whatever. We're going to do really, really deep dives into these children of Nietzsche, with the backbone course being understanding Nietzsche's Zarathustra. So we will end it there. So let me put a timestamp on this. I'm sorry, but that's a good ending point because he's going to get back to next verses and he decided to give up on that argument. So good. So we'll end it there and we'll end the recording and we'll go into our after conversation. Peace.